So, what we're going to look at first is what is the problem? Okay, is there a problem? And then before we do some analysis and talk about the issues that we find in industry, I think it's a good point to reflect on where we are. To look at how did we get to this point with this contract, with this project manager in it. As you've heard earlier, 30 years of NEC this year, so it's a good time to reflect on how things have gone. And also, whilst preparing for this, I've been reflecting on my own career somewhat as well, because I'm approaching 50. And if you go back 30 years, I was in my 20s sort of thing, wasn't I? So my career has tracked NEC's career pretty much. But also I was aware that I may be one of the last generation of people who remembers the bad old days. The days before there was an NEC, and was involved in the early days when people were grappling with what is this thing? How does it affect us? So, a bit of a history lesson, I think, before we go forwards. And then we'll look at some of the issues that we see in industry, and hopefully at the end we'll look at the fixes as well. How might we fix some of these issues? Firstly, what is the problem? Let's be blunt about it. Project managers cause disputes. It causes disputes due to their actions, due to their inactions, and due to their incorrect assessments. Problems we see, when I say problems, I am talking about disputes, and we've already heard some of these stories this morning already about programs not being accepted, arguments about defined cost and disallowed cost, compensation events not being accepted, and compensation events being assessed incorrectly. So, they're the issues we see at a very high level. We'll drop into some more specific issues later on. But before we do that, imagine you can hear Huey Lewis in the news in the background. My IT skills wouldn't allow me to do that. Okay? Now, also, Back to the Future is about 30 years old. I think it came out in 1985. At that time, that's when the ICE first started to review contracting, to say, is it working, can we do any better? And that's where the NEC was born, okay, with a fundamental review of contracting that NEC provided. So, let's look, and I'm going to go back in time. Now I'm going back further than Egan and Latham. I'm going all the way back to the post-war era. Some of you may have seen this slide before, I have used it previously. Now there's a quote at the top of this slide about the definition of madness, being repeating the same action over and over, hoping for a different result. Anybody know who said that? Albert Einstein, absolutely. And he was quite a clever bloke, so I think when he says something we should listen. We like a good overview in industry, it happens very regularly. I think today that, because there have been more reports done since then, I think we're up to about 18 in the post-war era, but the themes are consistently the same. That we can do better, that the industry is fragmented, it's inefficient, that we're adversarial, and maybe we should work together more effectively. So, I'm not going to go through all the details of that, but the reason for this is because this is where NEC was born. It was born of frustration, to quote a very old song. That Latham, when he produced his report in the 90s, was depressed that things hadn't changed. A whole generation had passed and things were still the same. And in a report that Thomson Cox Anderson produced, at the time only 6% of clients were satisfied with the existing contracts, which meant 94% of people were dissatisfied with them. This is where we were 30 years ago. So what was the change? The change was the new engineering contract. And the objective of all NEC contract, according to NEC, is to help the parties to avoid disputes. Sounds good, doesn't it? Now, we talked earlier about mutual trust and cooperation not being an objective of the contract. John, I think I trust you.
No.
This is a prized asset.
Yeah.
That is the new engineering contract. Can you see the words mutual trust and cooperation in there? No. They were not in the first edition of the contract. They were first introduced into the second edition of the contract as a result of Latham, to make it consistent with all Latham's principles. So just to reinforce John's and Leslie's point, mutual trust and cooperation is not an end in itself. The objectives, clarity, flexibility, and the stimulus to good management. Now John Perry who was one of the co-instigators of the NEC, said that that was probably the most important characteristic of the contract. And John Huff also quoted that the NEC had written project management techniques into a contract to produce more cooperation, more efficiency, and guess what? Fewer disputes. The big change was this project manager. Prior to NEC, there was no project manager. We had the ICE conditions of contract that had an engineer, and you can see the functions of the engineer are designer, contract administrator, quality control, and the dispute resolver. So the engineer was the first line of dispute avoidance or dispute resolution, because the project manager had to make a decision about his own actions. Sorry, the engineer had to make a decision on his own actions or inactions in that contract. When NEC was conceived, it was supposed to be divorcing these roles and allocating them to separate people. Again, an issue identified in the Latham report, that there are inherent conflicts of interest when the person designing the work is also the person monitoring its construction and also the person administering the contract. So the designer was supposed to be a separate organisation or entity from the project manager. The project manager was concerned with contract administration. Quality control was handed to this new role of supervisor, and the dispute resolver was supposed to be the adjudicator. Now in NEC Board we have senior representatives, and it's interesting to reflect on why senior representatives has found its way into the NEC contract. So, who are all these project managers? Where are they coming from? If you go back 30 years, when the profession is barely being conceived, where are they all coming from? What are they expected to do? Think of the ICE conditions. The engineer is dedicated to civil engineering works. But these project managers these days are managing schools, office blocks, hospitals, power stations, rail networks and highways as well as many, many other things. So where do they all come from? What training do they have to do their job? Which professional institutions are they affiliated to? Okay, so important questions to ask ourselves. Also, further issues created when often we see the same firm acting in all three roles of designer, project manager and supervisor. If you're the project manager, are you really going to raise an early warning about an issue you see with your design that your firm has produced? How likely are you to do that? But the contract says you should. So where is the risk? Is the risk the contract? Now hopefully most of us in this room will say that the risk is not the contract, that the contract is fit for purpose, it works well and it's being used widely around the world now, it's well tried and tested. So the risk isn't the contract, maybe the risk is the person in the middle of the contract. Maybe the risk is the project manager, but more specifically, maybe the risk is about the actions or inactions of the project manager. Now that statement might sound a little bit cynical, but we've already heard this morning of the issues that we still face in industry, that whilst most of us here are supporters and promoters of the contracts, the idea of avoiding disputes, minimising disputes, it's fantastic, but the reality is, so long as there are people, there will be disputes. Surely that is the nature of human beings. Martin Barnes identified the issue that how can the employer's agent, the engineer or the architect, EJCT contracts, how can they decide an issue impartially when the cause of the dispute is related to their own action or inaction? So the NEC uses a third party called the adjudicator as the first line dispute resolver. This was the intention back in 1993. So adjudication in NEC was intended to be an integrated part of the contract. It was supposed to deal with cost and program issues, not legal issues. And issues previously raised to the engineer would be raised to this independent adjudicator, who might be jointly appointed at the start by the parties potentially. And they deal with disputes about actions taken and not taken by the project manager. The intention was, this is a commercial and technical process, not a quasi-legal process. Damian, who sadly can't be here today, remembers seeing Martin Barnes speak in the early days. And he said that he wished he'd never called it adjudication in the NEC contract. He wished he'd come up with something else, because what we've got today is very different from what was intended. So, what happened? The Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act happened. 96 came into effect in 98. What was it supposed to do? Quick, cost-effective dispute resolution. Does it do what it says on the tin? You'll get quick. I guarantee you'll get quick, but you'll probably get quick and dirty. And what is it dealing with? What is the reality of the situation? It's dealing with final account adjudications. As we've heard this morning, we've had an expert witness up talking about adjudications that they're involved in with NEC. So we're very far away from what was intended, that we've got a process that mimics the courts and arbitration. So the practical impact of this on the NEC is that there's now a reluctance to raise issues to the first line dispute resolver, because we know that that's going to entail a lot of cost. It might fundamentally break the relationship. Okay, not what was intended. And now the first line resolver is not simply part of a contractual process for sorting out time and money issues, but is now part of a more formal and legal process. So we talk about actions and inactions of the project manager. What are they? Where are they defined in the contract? I've come up with 18 important NEC verbs. There may be more. If you find any, please let me know. Okay? But here are the ones I found from an initial inspection of the contract. And a lot of the issues I see are caused by these two. Accept or acceptance, and assess or assessment. Okay? So, what do they mean? Anybody recognise this quote? Sorry?
Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland. Mr. H. Dumpty. And I use the word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. So what does that actually mean? Accept, according to the Oxford Dictionary of English, means adequate, valid, suitable. Surely that means to me that the thing being accepted needs to be acceptable, good enough for its intended purpose. And what does assess mean? Assess means to evaluate or estimate. And according to Keating, that implies or suggests an idea of judgment or appraisal, that the person doing this is applying their professional skill to come up with an answer. Now, I did go back even deeper in time as part of this talk, but I haven't got the time to go through the history of civil engineering, which is where I ended up, and I have now 3 books about Brunel on my desk at home, sadly. But the point of this is, this role of this person in the contract who used to be called an engineer, it first started to be defined over 150 years ago in a case between Ranger and the Great Western Railway Company. And the law has evolved, as you can see, over that period of time to get us to where we are today. Okay, so I haven't got time to go through all that, but you can see alongside the development of the law, obviously the law usually is in lag of events, that you see the development of a profession. You see the development of various different professions, and then you see in the 1930s the introduction of standard forms of contract. So, moving on, because time doesn't allow, not often will I quote Jeremy Clarkson, but this tells us a bit. And the reason for this is because that first dispute was Brunel's dispute on the Great Western Railway. So, the engineer had a lot of jobs to do, is the takeaway from that slide. Not just the engineering bit, the designing bit, but lots of other things. Now, most engineers aren't involved at that level anymore. But, suffice to say, after his first dispute, Brunel thought he understood what it meant to be as an employer's agent or an engineer. He understood that his job was to maintain his position of umpire between the contractor and the company. Okay? Interesting to note that this is after 14 years of litigation. He's holding himself up to a future client in one of his letters to say, look, I know what I'm doing. This is how it should be done. Okay? That isn't Brunel at his worst. He did get worse after that. I think his best record was 19 years of litigation, at the end of which both his opponent and him had died. Let's not end up in these situations. Martin Barnes again. Clearly a very good engineer, but not a good project manager. Yeah? He remains the only engineer whose relationship with his contractor ever deteriorated to the point of premeditated physical violence. There were hundreds of men lined up against each other when Brunel decided to get rid of one contractor and bring a new one in. And the constabulary literally had to read them the Riot Act to get them to disband. So, I'm not holding up Brunel as an example of a good engineer who understood his role as the independent certifier. Now, skipping on a few years. Again, this is relevant to me because, as I've just said, I'm nearly 50. So this case was the year of my birth. And it very clearly tells us that the engineer, the project manager, the architect, call them what you want, wears two hats. That they have a duty to act on behalf of their client, but also a duty to act independently and impartially, and to make decisions in a fair and unbiased manner. And for many years, that was the seminal case on the role of employer's agent. How does that relevant to NEC? Skip forward some more time, and we end up with the dispute between Costain and Bechtel. There's an awful lot of history behind this dispute, but most people accept this as being a very persuasive bit of law around what is the project manager's role in this contract. And you'll see Mr. Justice Jackson says, when assessing sums payable, I think that means assessing amounts due and compensation events, it means they have a duty to act impartially between the employer and the contractor. So, moving on then, is that the reality? Is that what we actually see in industry, that project managers understand that they wear these two hats, and how well do they do when they're wearing them? So, letters from the trenches. So feedback from delegates. Damian and I over the years have delivered hundreds of NEC training sessions and workshops, so we get to hear a lot of the war stories, if you like, from what's actually happening out there. Some of them you've already heard this morning. Project managers not understanding the early warning process, reacting negatively to them, seeing it as a threat or a marker down for a claim of some sort. Or the project manager who stands up at the start of the contract and says, there won't be any early warnings on my contract. And then people start measuring how many early warnings there are as some kind of measure of success. The client imposing extensive additional program requirements. If you think, before NEC, there were no program requirements in a contract. The NEC was the first attempt to actually describe what a program should look like in a contract. So clause 31, clause 32, already extensive. Clients add a further overlay onto this. The project manager making spurious reasons why programs are neither realistic nor practicable. I see a few wry smiles and nods around the room. I'm not the only person to experience this. The contractor's being reluctant to notify early warnings if they are related to deficiencies they perceive in the project manager's design. Now, Niall, you're here somewhere, aren't you, today? I've seen you. There's a wave, where are you? There he is, there's Niall. Niall put a very interesting question in our LinkedIn group in the admin calendar before Christmas last year. Do you face problems getting an accepted program? The most popular post by a long stretch last year, 7,000 views, and nearly 90% of respondents said yes. Now that's telling us there's a problem. Now I'm not here to say that I think the problem is always the project manager. I think there are three possible sources of issues here. Firstly, is the NEC too ambitious? Is there too much in there already? And then we get clients who add another overlay of stuff that's required on top of that. Is it that the contractors don't do it? That they don't know how to do it? They don't have the skills to be able to produce compliant programs? Or is it unrealistic expectations on the part of the project manager? The answer is probably a combination of the three things. Question is, what do we do about it? So, example number one. Anybody know that one? Bit obscure, maybe Mark Twain. On the right, you see an extract from Contract Data Part 2. On the left, you see a communication from the project manager to the contractor. I'll let you read and digest that, and you can understand the point about denial. This project manager's got it round his ears. Yeah? I've not accepted a program, so there can't be an accepted program. Fundamentally, a misunderstanding that the program that he's referring to is the programming contract data part 2, and hopefully everybody here knows is the first accepted program. Misunderstanding of the first defined term in the contracts. These are powerful because these are real. Yeah? You can talk the theory, but when you see it, it's quite shocking, isn't it? Now, we've got the sound issues, so I'll have to talk over. That's a shame. That was going to be quite dramatic. Again, my Freddy days are over. We've heard about this already today. The overlay, the additional requirements. So we've got clause 31, clause 32, then anything else that the scope says. Another 6 requirements in the scope. That's not too bad, is it? Hang on a second. What does that one say? That's a reference to 198 pages of additional requirements. Give us a chance. What are the chances of ever getting an accepted program with that kind of amendment, yeah? Other war stories, computer says no. Anybody heard of this DCMA 14-point test? Yeah? Computer says no. Put the program in the software, it measures it against 14 metrics, and it will tell the project manager whether to accept the program or not. Where's the professional skill and judgment in that? I've got a client who decided to test this, built his program backwards, started with the finishing and finished with the starting. And it passed the test. No intelligence there, is there? For the want of a nail, the wall was won, yeah? Oh, lost, sorry. Program's not being accepted due to minor technicalities. Yeah? Again, lots of bright smiles. We recognise these issues. Was it Frankie Howard? Nay, nay, and thrice nay? Safer to reject than accept. Project managers seeing themselves as the rejecter of things. I think that's backwards, isn't it? Time waits for no man. PM taking into account progress since the program was submitted. 2 weeks to accept the program, by which time there's 2 weeks more progress. Guess what? It didn't turn out as the contractor had forecast, therefore reject program. Again, give us half a chance, will you? Will the program ever be perfect, i.e. 100% correct? What do we think?
Only what you
think. What do you think? Are we looking for a gourmet meal? The answer is no, it doesn't have to be perfect, it has to be acceptable. Maybe that's good enough. I get home from work late, I'm hungry, I'm just going to bang something in the microwave and it covers the bases, it's fine. It is acceptable, it is adequate. A new concept, the accepted program. Some war stories from compensation events. Information overload. PM needs every last piece of information before making a decision. Top tip for PMs, you want to reject something, just ask for more information. It's the easiest way to reject something you can come up with. Yeah? There's a point where you have to stop asking for more information and come up with your own opinion. Easy as 1, 2, 3. Mechanistic delay analysis, ignoring actual events and other records. Yeah? So we just make a decision based on things within the 4 corners of the program. We ignore other things we know about that have happened on the job. How do we know about them? I think we have regular meetings, don't we? We have early warnings about things. Hopefully every now and again the PM goes out onto site and has a look for themselves. Yeah? If you know there's been a delay and you're assessing a compensation event, surely you have to assess some delay. It might be challenging because you might not have an up-to-date program, but that doesn't change the responsibility to make an assessment. And this one, a very favourite one from very recent experience. The contractor didn't ask for an extension of time, so the PM didn't assess it. That's what was said in the adjudication. Do we agree with that? What do we think? Anybody? This is related to a compensation event that increased the value of the contract by 50%. On what planet did the project manager think there would not be an extension of time in there somewhere? Yeah? It was a scope change. So it's clearly a client risk. 50% increase in value, but no extension of time. Yeah? Not good enough. You've got to assess something. You've got to make a fair and reasonable assessment in accordance with the contract and in the spirit of mutual trust cooperation. Will CE assessments ever be 100% correct? Will they ever be perfect? No, they won't be, will they? Again, we're looking for the gourmet meal and it doesn't exist. They are assessed. Remember, that means good enough. Have to apply judgment sometimes. You won't have it all nailed down. You're going to have to exercise some professional skill and care. Defined cost war stories. PM insisting defined cost must be justified or it will be disallowed. This tends to happen at the end when the late audit occurs. Now, I've heard about this for years, rumoured as a thing that happens, but never personally experienced it until recently. So you've got your asset, it's built, it's actually in operation as this asset, yet the PM is starting to disallow costs for things like concrete because he's not seen the contractor's accounts. Is that what the project manager is supposed to be doing? Surely not. And back to Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Some of you are aware of this issue because I have consulted some of you on this. But apparently open market means a lower rate than is available on the open market. Both parties looked in the law and all of a sudden said, can't find any case law on what open market actually means. So the client decides that means it's arguable. We think, well, maybe that's the case because it's obvious. Who knows? Will defined cost going to be 100% correct? You know where we're going. No. We're assessing it, judgment, and appraisal. So, solutions then. Glenn, how do I do for time, by the way?
Not that many left, so just talking.
Everyone's enjoying themselves, that's fine. Solutions, senior representatives, I mentioned it earlier. Introducing to NEC4, maybe to solve the problem that things haven't turned out as NEC intended. That it would be resolved within the four corners of the contract without going somewhere else. Senior representatives, so give it to them, they can resolve it. So, remember, early warning number one, the project manager. Okay, well, again, Marty Barnes identified that the issue with previous contracts is that the engineer is in conflict from day one, and this is an extraordinary paradox. And with senior representatives, the same thing happens. The senior reps aren't independent, are they? So you've got a commercial tension, and the same paradox exists there. So time will tell how successful that is. For me, personal experience, 50-50. I've seen it go really well, and it's worked, and I've seen it where the client didn't turn up. They turned up in person, but not in spirit. You see what I mean? Divorce the roles. Separate the design function from the project management function and ensure the supervisor is from a different organisation. That might work, might it? Again, that was the initial intention of the contract. How about bringing somebody else in? Again, back to the original intent, bring in somebody to be that first line within the contract, without having to go outside and have a formal dispute resolution process. Maybe the joint appointment of somebody at the start would help with this. How about calling them what they are? Remember the old Ron C advert? Does what it says on the tin, yeah? So change them from project managers because they're not managing the project. They might be, but in this contract, they're managing the contract. This is where you hear clients talk about, oh, well, I've got a project manager, and then I've got an NEC project manager. No, you've got a contract manager. Okay? And my work, how about making it explicit in the contract rather than having to infer something from Castaigne and Bechtel a new clause 10.3 requiring the project manager to act impartially. What do you think? Ian, if you need the words, save you the job. Does that seem like such a ludicrous suggestion? Anybody old enough to remember the ICE conditions of contract impose exactly the same duty on the engineer? It would clarify, wouldn't it? It would make it absolutely abundantly clear that you have a specific duty. And now I don't, those words might need a bit of wordsmithing, but you get the idea. Okay. How about education? Does the secret to all this lie making sure that our project managers know what they're doing? Not only do they have appropriate education and qualifications and training, but they also have the experience required as well. It's depressing these days when you ask graduates, so how much time did you spend on NEC then? It's depressing that they spent an afternoon on it once. You know? Project managers doing project management degrees. Great, you learn all about project management. How much do you learn about NEC? And how to manage an NEC contract? Okay? So, some issues there to think about. Now, final quote for the day. Well, penultimate one to be fair. Anyone know that one? Malcolm X. Okay. So, I will leave you with the words, hopefully, if it works, of the Wizard of Oz.
Where I come from, we have universities, seats of great learning, where men go to become great thinkers. And when they come out, they think deep thoughts, and with no more brains than you have. But they have one thing you haven't got, a diploma. Therefore, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Universitatis Comitiatum e Pluribus Unum, I hereby confer upon you the honorary degree of PhD.
Thank you very much.